Greetings, adventurers. Have you ever had a time where you had a DM or a campaign where one player seemed to be favored, be it either the DM was dating them, or maybe they just had a lot more sway in the group than you did? The TLDR for today's story is player makes his character extremely overpowered, GM makes him the main character of the campaign and gives him all he wants, and everything goes horrible. Welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. Today's treasure is called GM Encourages One Player's Main Character Syndrome. Let's jump right into the story. Good day, fellow horror enthusiasts. Longtime lurker on the subreddit, today I decided to share an old story about my first time taking part in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign as a player after DMing for 3+ years. I sincerely hope it will entertain you as much as it's given me nightmares. So here we go. First and foremost, I kept playing with this group for too long, and I know I should have quitted months before I actually did. The reason I didn't is simple. The group was set up by two of my girlfriend's best friends, and she begged me to stay even just as an excuse to hang out with them. They're cool people, so I endured as much as I could until it was too much. Cast of the show: me, girlfriend, friend 1, friend 2, protagonist, and GM. Characters and details of the campaign are not important right now, but I'll be happy to share them in another horror story, let me know in case. For now, let's concentrate on the two reasons for our collective suffering. Protagonist, a player with astounding main character syndrome, and the GM, which deserves at least an introduction. Our GM, which I consider to be a huge part in turning the game into literal hell, was not very good. His style of GMing included not preparing anything in advance and always improvising everything, railroading everyone on the only path he prepared 10 minutes before the session, not caring about game balance, stealing ideas from the latest video game, book, movie he saw, total incapability of handling issues between players. I could talk for hours about how much of a disaster this 1-year-long campaign was, but I'll leave it for another time. The last thing you need to know about this GM is that he basically worshipped Protagonist, frequently asking him for help during sessions and treating him like the best Dungeons & Dragons player that ever lived. This is probably what gave Protagonist the idea that he could do anything he wanted in the game since, well, he's so good. Out of game, Protagonist was pretty chill and usually brought many interesting stories to share with us, which led to most of the table, myself included, for a while, to feel sympathy for him. As time went by, however, his in-game behavior made pretty much everyone regret ever sitting at that table, aside from GM, which of course had no problem about him or his character. Let's get to the good stuff. Here I summed up more than 1 year of accumulated horror and despair into everything that was wrong about Protagonist and GM. Please note that not all was clear from the beginning, and some things took time to figure out since both had always many excuses to justify such elements in the game. So starting off with this story, the GM is actually going to be a very big factor in here because they actually help amplify the problem player's issues. In a lot of these stories, the problem player can only go as far as the GM allows, and in this case, the GM not only allows it, but actually reinforces it over and over again, as we'll see over the course of this story. I think it's important too to point out that the GM doesn't do a lot of preparation, which would be totally fine, but it seems like because he uses the problem player as a crutch sometimes, he overly appreciates the input of the problem player, and that puts the problem player in a position where the GM will never challenge him and he runs wild. Back to the story. Number 1, his background. We all start at level 3, so all the backstories for our characters were pretty simple, such as traveling wizard with thirst for knowledge, or wanted rogue looking to make a living. Protagonist instead presented himself as a demigod knight, firstborn of the most powerful household in the entire kingdom, renowned warrior who won many wars for his king, and to top it all off, descendant of an angel whose blood allowed him to use magic even as a martial class. The GM allowed everything since it's such a cool concept, and always gave him magic items and extra abilities to match his background strength even as a level 3 PC. He was so strong he could basically wipe the entire rest of the party if he so desired. This will come into play later. When somebody noted that it was a little bit too much, GM replied with, "You could have done the same with your backstory. Sorry." Except that later, when my girlfriend's PC died and she tried to roll up a bard with a magical instrument that never failed a note, it was deemed too powerful by the protagonist and rejected by the GM. Guess world-ending powers are less dangerous than music. So now we can see that the background's a little excessive. I think it's important to realize as new players that a level 3 character, their backstory can only be so big. Maybe they beat a local encampment of goblins. Maybe they beat one kinda larger size creature of the forest that the local militia or town guard couldn't handle. Anyways, let's move on to part 2 for now. Number 2, his amazing roleplay. As soon as session 1 began, Protagonist presented himself as a leader of the party and told everyone to follow his orders. Mind that our characters never met beforehand, but since he was a renowned noble warrior, we went along with it. The GM allowed it because it makes sense. Everyone would assume he's in charge because insert background reason. At first, we simply followed his commands and got the game rolling. Things soon started to take a turn for the worse. What Protagonist meant with follow my orders was that he would handle any plot element, NPC discussion, decision, strategy, even our daily schedule. Each attempt of our characters to do something on our own will be met with annoyance, and the protagonist always tried to stop us, meddle in, or straight up ask the GM to skip our turns because we're wasting time, I want to proceed. The GM, of course, backed him up every time. We sneak out to do something that protagonist doesn't want to do, the GM replies with, "You tried to do that but fail," or "You look for this but you can't find it," and then goes back to protagonist. We complain about his behavior, he's just role-playing. We do anything that upsets him, he rolls a +50 on Intimidate using his angelic aura, and the GM declares that we're too terrified to even think about challenging him. Now that's what I call fairness. So you see in part 2, the guy's finally living up to his protagonist title that the OP gave him. He says stuff like follow my orders, which might make sense at the beginning just because he's kind of like the tutorial leader, like the de facto leader because of his backstory. But it becomes very blatantly clear that he's abusing his power as the de facto leader because he's actually talking to the GM, making them skip turns and go out of his way to meddle or have direct input and control over every little character action that the players try to have in the story. It's also very uncommon for a GM to let people use social checks such as Intimidate on other player characters because it's just considered another form of PvP. But the fact that there's a +50 to it, kind of like a homebrew angelic aura situation, just makes it very clear that the GM has a clear favorite character and nothing's going to really change that. And we'll see what the final straw is going into part 3. Number 3. He's the main character. If what I've told you up until now has not yet satisfied your horror hunger, there's some highlights of what happened during the actual game. I picked the finest, but almost every session included 3 or 4 variants of what is described here. 1. Protagonist never has to make a roll for anything. He's so strong he cannot fail. I try to persuade a nobleman for information. I roll a 14. Too low. He does not tell me anything. Protagonist talks to the same person. He recognizes you as a great heir of a powerful lord and greets you with all the honors. Then tells him everything, also offers gold as a gift. No rolls required. 2. Since he's the leader, all the loot from the dungeons and the quests is automatically given to him by the GM. He then proceeds how to split it, keeping the best and allowing us to have the rest. If we even once bothered him, we got nothing because we didn't deserve anything. Also, any treasure that we found was locked behind some safety mechanism that only protagonist could unlock, just to make sure that no one could take something before him. 3. Protagonist wanted to have a mount, and he requested a dragon. GM told him he had to wait until level 12 since apparently that's the level required to ride a dragon. Protagonist whines because that would take too long and starts getting angry because I'm already powerful enough, I don't think that I should wait. GM ended up having us meet an adult dragon at level 7 who immediately recognized the incredible power of Protagonist and requested to be his mount. Imagine Den of the Drake reading about this one. 4. After we returned from a battle, Protagonist received a letter. His parents were killed by an evil cult when he was away. We interpreted it as a plot device to make us fight against the cult. Instead, Protagonist declared that he didn't care about his parents and only went back home to be proclaimed as the new lord. He gained a castle, a personal army, several servants, and also a ton of gold and magic items that the cult did not steal for reasons. Nothing was shared with us aside from a couple of items he already had. The cult was never brought up afterwards. This is pretty much everything. There might be other stuff that I can't remember, it's been a while, but I feel like you get the picture. The campaign pretty much stopped being fun for me and everyone else after a couple of months, but we still kept going because we enjoyed each other's company and our characters had some fun chemistry. In the end, I left the campaign for good after the GM started stealing ideas from my campaign and putting them in his game thinking I wouldn't notice. I know they tried to keep things going for a while after giving up. I don't know what Protagonist or GM are up to these days, but I fortunately found other groups to play with. I'm having fun, and I'm now very careful on not playing favoritism with my players. At least, this helped me host great adventures with great people. So the story laid out 4 very good examples of why this character had main character syndrome, and I think the takeaway here, again, is that the GM and the protagonist worked hand in hand to create this scenario. I think the second example is a perfect example of a cut and dry favoritism where only the protagonist and the de facto leader gets to open the loot box, and then he can divvy out to the players based on how he felt they performed, which is just kind of an insane thing to do. As a dungeon master, you kind of want to have a combination of random luck, so like you're rolling on tables and you're having different variables where anyone could maybe claim a piece of loot, but then also you want to have divvied out specific loot items. Maybe it's tied to an ancestry of a certain race or class, so that everyone gets a little bit. For example, when the new player character wanted that magical instrument that didn't miss a note, that'd be an example of a very targeted and well-earned artifact that you could put at the end of a dungeon, but I'm sure that the protagonist here wouldn't let the player have it either way. That concludes the story for today, though. Thanks for stopping by to Loot Goblin Marketplace. We have a Discord that you can use if you're looking to share your own stories. We also launched a Patreon and a merch store if you want to support the channel in other ways. We really appreciate all the people who have been coming and watching these videos over the last few months, which is why we've offered specific Discord roles for people who subscribe to certain tiers, and we'll showcase you at the end of these videos. Thank you again for stopping by, and farewell for now.